Hi, Mark Sedgwick. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Could you give us a brief biography of yourself, please?
Yeah, I mean, I was born in London, so I'm British by origin at least, and in the 80s I moved to Cairo, taught at the American University in Cairo, and then in 2007 I moved to a job here in Denmark at the University of Aarhus, where I'm now Professor of Arab and Islamic Studies.
Excellent. So what I want to talk to you about today is traditionalism.
Yeah.
And it's a topic that I think a lot of people get wrong a lot of the time. I think a lot of people think it means people that are into traditional values, and etc. So
Yes.
I figured to start off, let's just quickly coin what traditionalism actually is, and then we'll get a bit more into the kind of characters involved with it.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, I mean, of course, there is more than one sort of traditionalism. And somebody who does like traditional values or bow ties or something like that can also be described as a traditionalist with a sort of lower T. And then there are Catholic traditionalists who don't like what happened at the Second Vatican Council and so forth. But the traditionalists that I've been working on, and that I think are actually the most interesting ones, could be described as Guenonian traditionalists, because the work of the French philosopher esotericist Rene Guenon is central to everything. So if we're going to understand traditionalism in those terms, we have to understand what Guenon meant by tradition. And Guenon wrote a lot about what he called the perennial tradition. And the perennial tradition, perennial sort of means eternal. It's been around since forever, and it'll be around forever. And by tradition, he meant something close to wisdom or truth or something like that. So traditionalism is fundamentally about eternal truth. And the truth is metaphysical. The truth, religious is a bit complicated to use in this case, but Guénon himself said metaphysical. He also used the term esoteric a lot, so we could say that it's eternal esoteric truth. And of course, eternal esoteric truth, goes back many thousands of years. And whereas the sort of traditional is in the sense of the bow tie, and when they started wearing bow ties, late 19th century, I think. As far as the real tradition is concerned, late 19th century isn't traditional at all. Late 19th century is modern.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that it seems to be having a bit of a renaissance at the moment, a word that the traditionalists don't like themselves, but because you wrote a book prior to this current one that seemed to sort of declare the end of traditionalism almost, and then you changed your mind. What kind of brought you round on that?
Well, what brought me round was events. And what I learned is one should be careful about making predictions. But in a sense, I wasn't entirely wrong, because traditionalism has always divided into two streams, one of which is primarily esoteric and one of which is primarily political. And the reason that in the earlier book I said that I thought that it was, perhaps coming to an end, is that when I looked for equivalents today, or that was 20 years ago, equivalents then to the leading key figures of the esoteric traditionalism, which had been especially strong during the second half of the 20th century, I couldn't really find major figures like that. So I thought, well, okay, perhaps the wind is coming down or something like that. And what then I didn't expect 20 years ago, but what has very clearly happened since, is the political stream has interested more and more people and has become more and more significant in alternative politics and even sometimes in mainstream politics.
Yeah, you see people like Bannon and Dugin referring
yeah.
to themselves as traditionalists now, don't you? Which is interesting. But
and Bannon, I mean, those are probably the two best known, and they're traditionalists in slightly different ways, because Dugin started his career as a traditionalist and has added various things onto it. And Dugin, traditionalism is essentially an intellectual movement, and Dugin is an intellectual, and he's given I don't know how many lectures and written I don't know how many books on a wide range of topics. The earliest ones were purely traditionalist, and the later ones are adding extra things to it. Whereas Bannon is I mean, he's far from stupid, but he's not an intellectual. He's more of an activist. He doesn't write books. So for Bannon, I think traditionalism is something which has been important for his own development, whereas but not central. Whereas for Dugin, it's been central and remains central.
So let's look at some of the kind of key characters of traditionalism, because really, I mean, and there's definitely a bifurcation, as you were saying earlier on, between two of them in particular. I'd say obviously Evola and Guenon, they seem to very much at some point take very different paths. But let's start off with Guenon, and sort of what was, I mean, how did Guenon sort of start, as it were? What was the kind of atmosphere around him at the time? You know, what bred a Guenon?
I mean, he started at the very end of the 19th century as a student in Paris of what was then called the Belle Époque, where there was so much going on in every possible respect, and this was the end of the period which had been so productive in philosophy and art. If one thinks about painting, can one think about painting without Paris in the late 19th century? So what we all know about is the painting, but there were all sorts of things going on also politically on the left, and in terms of what nowadays we tend to call esotericism, and what at the time was often called occultism. And I mean, nowadays the term occultism has acquired some quite negative associations for many people. So the term tends not to be used much nowadays, but it was more used then, and Guenon, the young Guenon, got involved in all sorts of the occultist activities of late 19th century Paris. And he worked his way through a number of organizations, and then finally decided that a lot of them were fraudulent, or as he said when he wrote about the Theosophical Society, he called it a pseudo-religion. So not authentic. And therefore, in the end, just a load of nonsense, or possibly even worse than that.
Well, Blavatsky's certainly been outed in the last few decades as somewhat of a fantasist when it comes to.
Well, there were. I mean, it does seem that there were sort of fake windows and moving walls and things like that. There was a certain amount of the obviously fraudulent going on, but there was an awful lot of reading and repurposing of earlier traditions. So I think it's a bit difficult to be a fully paid up theosophist today, given that some of the secret messages written in was it gold ink on purple paper or purple ink on gold paper? I mean, these are very difficult to take seriously nowadays. But her writings, I think, have to be taken seriously, because so much of the New Age, for example, actually came through Blavatsky. So
much of it still does. I recently visited a place in Italy called Damanhur, which is like a community that, and immediately the moment I saw the symbology they used and the language they were using, it was Blavatskyism. It was Atlantis, and it was clearly directly linked to Blavatsky. It was interesting. I hadn't really seen any so blatant Blavatskyan kind of groups of late, but it was kind of fascinating.
Yeah,
And I think
I went there once, and it was a great visit.
Oh yeah, they're great. They're nice people. It was, but yeah, and I think what people don't realize is that at that particular time, Blavatsky and Theosophy in particular were kind of the dominant esoteric group, weren't they? Really, I mean, there was
absolutely,
yeah.
No, I mean, they were so they were so all embracing that if you were going to be doing anything at all, it was hard not to pass through the Theosophical Society.
Yeah, and then obviously you had the Golden Dawn coming in slightly later, and that kind of kick-started the Western esoteric tradition, which was so you have these kind of competing traditions almost, don't you? And it's an interesting period. I find the interest as it becomes, and this is where I was talking a little earlier. I sort of start to sympathize a bit of Guenon. The more you look into the history of both groups, actually, you start to find interesting artistic liberties, let's say, with it's a shame.
But anyhow, so that's Guénon's, that's Guénon's background. That's where he started, and that's what he, in many ways, rejected, but also in some ways continued. I think.
When did he start to develop a kind of perennial view?
Well, the perennial idea, the idea that there has been this ancient wisdom. I mean, you find that in Blavatsky. It's if you try and trace its emergence, most historians say that it emerges during the Renaissance, and there's definitely one stream of it which you can trace from Renaissance Florence up to Leibniz. And this has been done several times. But you can also spot traces of it earlier on in early Christianity, for example, and then when for Leibniz, it's part of the sort of Enlightenment debate about what is religion really and what do we do with it. And we've had the Reformation, and we've now got the reign of reason, and can we be reasonable and religious at the same time? And is there a reasonable religion and that sort of thing? But by the time we get to the late 19th century, that debate's basically over. And what we are getting instead, I think, with Blavatsky and then with Guénon as well, is we've got people who are saying, okay, we've been through the Christianity thing. It turned out not to be very satisfactory. What shall we do now? Where shall we turn now? And of course, this coincided with the period where a lot of non-European religious texts were being translated and becoming available. So one place that people started to look was at non-European religions. And Blavatsky herself, as you surely know, turned to Buddhism. And that was part of a very important trend, very long trend. I mean, people still go to the East in search of religious wisdom. And Guenon himself did this, although not towards Buddhism. I mean, he was initially quite hostile to Buddhism, probably partly because of his hostility to Blavatsky. He was persuaded later on to take a kinder view of Buddhism. But his interests were initially in Hinduism and in Sufism.
So why those two in particular? Because they seem to be the kind of bedrocks of his.
Yeah. I mean, I think Hinduism, because everybody was into Hinduism at that point. You know, everybody was reading the Vedas and the Vedantas and all the different Hindu scriptures which had been translated and were fascinating people and trying to find wisdom in that. So it's not surprising that he was reading these Hindu texts, because that's what one would read in that period if one was interested in the esoteric. The Sufism was unusual, and I think the reason for that is actually simply that he met this guy who we now call Ageli, Ivan Ageli, who was also known as Abdul Hadi, who was actually by origin, he was Swedish. He was partly a painter, partly an art critic, partly interested in esotericism. And he had spent years in Egypt and had learned Arabic and had learned quite a lot about Sufism. He was pretty well informed in both the theory and to some extent the practice of Sufism. And somehow, we don't know how, somehow he met Guenon, or Guenon met him. And Guenon was fascinated by what Ageli had to say about Sufism. And the first journal that Guenon edited just before the First World War was initially, he was the editor and Ageli was one of the contributors. And as the journal carried on and they lost more and more contributors, finally it ended up being Guenon and Ageli. And then the thing collapsed and there were no more issues. And Ageli went back to Egypt and disappears entirely from the story. But at this particular point in Guénon's foundation, when he's becoming increasingly skeptical about occultism, about Blavatsky, about theosophy, as being pseudo religion, and up pops this guy who knows real Sufism. There's nothing pseudo about Ageli's understanding of Sufism, and there's nothing pseudo about the Sufism that he's understanding either. I mean, this is the heart of the Islamic esoteric tradition, and Ageli speaks almost perfect French. Ageli, as a young man, had been reading Swedenborg, so Ageli knows enough about the West mystical and esoteric tradition to be able to speak effectively and convincingly to somebody like Guenon, who's got a background in this. So that, I think, is how Guenon gets into Sufism, and why Sufism becomes so important for traditionalism and ultimately for Guenon personally.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sufism is something we haven't really covered properly yet, but it's an oral tradition, isn't it? It's generally speaking, it's a master-student kind of progression.
The Sufi path very much emphasizes the master-student relationship, although it always leaves room for what some people call the direct path, because the fundamental idea is that the individual Sufi is seeking to return to his origin or her origin, which most of the time means God, and God either responds to the attempt to reach him, or conceivably, because that's how God is, conceivably just looks at somebody and says, "Okay, I'll take you."
Yeah,
And then that person reaches God instantly without any. But this doesn't mean so it's just an oral tradition. I mean, most Sufis who've ever lived have been illiterate, because most people who've ever lived have been illiterate, right? To pick up that part. But there is also an extensive written tradition of philosophy and theology and poetry. And one of the top Sufi poets is, of course, Rumi. And for some reason, Rumi seems to have caught on much more in the United States than in the United Kingdom. But I think you probably find some Rumi in most bookstores in the United Kingdom as well. So, I mean, this of course is a later development. The popularity of Rumi that started after Guenon died, but that's part of the literary tradition of Sufism, the world all familiar with increasingly.
Before we look into like the boogeyman of Guenon with modernity, I was wondering, Guenon, in an article you sent me, Guenon sort of brushed on the Yazidi, and I was always interested in what did Guenon write a lot about was he interested in the Yazidi, because they seem like a candidate as well.
Guenon was interested in absolutely everything. So he was certainly briefly interested in the Yazidis. They didn't. I mean, in the end, he was interested in everything and only pursued certain things. And the Yazidis is some things he didn't particularly pursue, but it did come within his range of interest.
Yeah, it was interesting. He sort of brushed on it in that article briefly, but I was wondering if he ever went any deeper. But so yeah, I brought up the boogeyman. When did modernity become such a dirty word for Guenon, and how did that sort of develop? This kind of seeing this as the thing that is anti-traditionalist.
Well, I mean, what happened is that he started to see when he started to find the real tradition, the real perennial tradition, in classic non-European sources, like the Hindu texts, like Sufism, he became more and more critical of specifically Western modernity. And the West and the modern West became increasingly the same thing. And then he ended up with this pair of tradition and modernity. Tradition good, modernity bad. East and West, which was the titles of Orient and Occident. So East and West, which is the title of one of his earlier books, and that became a pair too. So the East was the place where you could find the perennial tradition, and the West was the place where the perennial tradition had been lost. Had not always been lost, but had been increasingly lost since the Renaissance, and was more and more lost as modernity developed, to the extent that in the end modernity could be defined as the loss of tradition. And that is the heart of his critique of modernity, and it's very fundamental, because once you've decided that modernity is the loss of tradition, modernity is the negation of tradition. Modernity is the negation of truth. then everything about modernity becomes a lie. The idea of progress becomes a lie. The idea of human equality becomes a lie. The idea of democracy becomes a lie. And you're not left with very much.
No. And actually, that's an interesting point to maybe start to look at one of the other main characters, because this is clearly where the political side can kind of slip in a little bit. So the second big character, I'd say, in traditionalism is Julius Evola.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about what birthed rather Evola, and what kind of culture did he come from?
Yeah, well, Evola first becomes really visible just after the end of the First World War, when he, as a painter, he gets involved in the Dada movement. And he's a pretty good painter. He's a pretty good theoretician of art. He writes about the theory of the Dada movement. And like many other painters, this gets him involved in the esoteric, magical, alternative world.
I was really struck by the parallels there, actually, between Guenon and Evola. Their kind of entryway into it's quite similar, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And then one of the oddities in Italy at this time is that the esoteric alternative leads to the political alternative. Now, this is also the case in Paris before the First World War. And Ageli, the Sufi who I was talking about earlier, first got involved in the anarchist movement, and then he later got involved in the early animal rights movement. But in Italy, what Evola and other people got involved in was not anarchism, but fascism, which, of course, as we know, has roots in the left as well.
Yeah.
We think of it as defining the right, but actually that variety of right does have roots in the left. But anyhow, that's what Evola had got involved in, and he got involved with other people who were interested in magic and in promoting fascism. And they were subsequently a bit disappointed, because instead of getting involved with magic, fascism ended up making an agreement with the Catholic Church, which was very much getting in bed with the enemy, as far as everyone.
Kind of the antithesis, really, isn't it?
But this is one of the keys to understanding Evola. He'd already got interest in the esotericism, magic, and he'd lost interest in art. He carried on painting throughout his life, but he became much more interested in politics and political activism. So he was already pro-fascist when he discovered Guenon and Guénon's critique of modernity, and Guénon's concept of the primordial tradition. So, because he was already interested, there are other people. There are people who come along later who were interested in ecology, and then they discover Guénon. So, of course, they apply Guénon to ecology. But with Evola, he applied Guénon's understanding to politics, and more or less single-handed created political traditionalism.
Yeah, it's interesting. He does Evola come from an aristocratic background generally? Because that's one of the things you always hear about Evola, that he was an aristocrat.
Yeah, well, the Baron. Right?
The Baron, yeah, yeah.
Given that his father was a telegraph operator,
so that's a no then.
That's a no. Yeah.
Yeah.
What quite how it happened? No, is not really clear. Towards the end of the Second World War, when he was living under a pseudonym to avoid arrest, he promoted himself to Count.
Oh, okay. Count Evola.
No, not Evola. Excuse me. Count something else. I can't quite. Count von something or other. I can't.
Right.
No, but he didn't. He did. It depends, of course, what you mean by aristocratic.
Mm.
And in his own terms, aristocratic referred to a nobility of spirit, not to having inherited a title. And he complained that a lot of 20th century so-called aristocrats were better at manipulating the cocktail shaker or the tennis racket than the sword. And as far as he was concerned, real aristocracy was about fighting, was about being a warrior.
And that's interesting because when you look at kind of contemporary, like some contemporary internet personalities, they seem to parrot that same. So Andrew Tate would be a good example, where it's all about combat and strength and kind of using that to kind of kind of bolster a masculinity and that kind of thing. It smacks a little bit of Evola.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. And I wonder. I don't know whether Andrew Tate reads Nietzsche. Do you think Andrew Tate?
I don't know. He might do. He does seem quite intelligent, but he it's quite possible. But I don't know.
I don't know. But Nietzsche tends to crop up in the background of so many of these things.
Yeah.
I mean, Evola. Everybody read Nietzsche, right? And Evola certainly read Nietzsche and certainly took certain things from Nietzsche. And even if whether or not Andrew Tate is sitting in his Romanian prison cell reading Nietzsche, I mean, he's certainly, he and all these other people are certainly influenced by certain Nietzschean ideas.
Yeah. So there's a fantastic quote from Evola that fascism didn't ruin Italy, Italy ruined fascism, I think was the...
Yes.
So how did he fall out with fascism then?
Well, I mean, firstly, Mussolini made the dreadful mistake of making this agreement with the Catholic Church. And the whole fascist movement, which started off with such glorious ideas, ended up as very much a bourgeois enterprise. And not every fascist official was really an Ubermensch or a great warrior or anything like that. And for a lot of these people, including for Dugin, this is extremely important. Fascism got itself into an alliance with Nazism and lost the Second World War, which was a significant failure, one might say.
Yeah.
So, I mean, clearly after that, whatever one thought of fascism during the fascist period, and Evola clearly had a lot of reservations about fascism, although he supported it. He clearly had a lot of reservations about it even during the fascist period. But after the fascist period, when fascism had proved its own problems, proved its own inadequacy by failing, he became even more critical of it.
And he started to there's a period where he's advising the Nazis as well, I believe.
Well, yes, okay, it's not exactly advising them, but during the Second World War, after. Fine. At the very, very beginning, he tried to advise the Nazis, and they were not interested. And the SS actually made an internal order saying that people were to avoid this Italian no more contact with it. But then in around 42, the Nazis got more interested again with him because he was writing about race. The Nazis were, as we know, obsessed with race, and they thought that whatever they were saying about race was a good way to understand Italian fascist views on race. Which in a way it was, because Mussolini at that point had got interested in what Evola was writing about race. So he did, in a sense, represent Italian thinking. Then, at the very end of the Second World War, after Mussolini is pushed out and has to be rescued by German troops and is initially taken back to Germany, and Evola is at that point in Germany, because otherwise, the new government in Italy probably would have arrested him, like the other people who've been leading, like in the fascist regime. So Evola happens to be at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia when Mussolini has been rescued and is taken to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. And there's a photograph of Mussolini and Hitler and a few other people sort of chatting with each other. And there's a man in the background who some people think might be Evola, but frankly, it's very indistinct image, so it's very difficult to see. But although he might perhaps have been in that group, he wasn't playing a leading role.
He was allowed to publish works in Germany, wasn't he? Which was quite unique.
Yes, which is very interesting, and it represents a reversal of the earlier approach that we don't want to hear anything more from this man, because I was talking about race, and he publishes in Germany a book called Basics of Fascist Racial Teaching. And what is so interesting about this book is that in the first couple of pages, he says some very sarcastic things about Nazi racial teaching. I mean, specifically, he says that their biological approach might be fine if it was a question of breeding racehorses or pedigree dogs, but that human beings are actually a bit more complex than that. And to try and do a purely biological racism. I mean, he doesn't say as you Nazis do, but I mean, obviously that's what he's talking about. Is simplistic. And I don't know how many other people were publishing in Nazi Germany in 1942 books which were criticizing fundamental aspects of Nazism.
Yeah, it's quite unique, isn't it? Yeah. So one imagines that with his views on race, that he must have had a fairly dim view of Sufism and especially Hinduism, I would have thought.
No, I mean, because his ideas on race were very different from the Nazi ideas. I mean, he doesn't divide the world into Aryans and others. He doesn't even divide the world into whites and others. he divides the world into people who might be warriors and people who might make cocktails.
Mm.
And the fascist government of Italy gets quite worried about this, because now he starts suggesting that Italy, Italians are actually two different races, which isn't the message they want to be put across at all at this point. So, yes, he believes in race, but that doesn't mean to say that he's in any way anti-Indian or anti-Arab or anti-Sufi. And he actually gets interested in Tantra. He gets interested in aspects of Hinduism. He never gets particularly interested in Sufism. He seems to think that that's something which that's Guenon. And he says somewhere that converting to Islam and Sufism like Guenon did requires a very fundamental shift of mentality, and also involves languages that he doesn't know.
Yeah, fair enough.
So he's not even really saying objecting to people becoming Muslim and Sufi.
I was struck when he spoke about races. He almost seems to parrot the caste system, the Indian caste system.
Oh no, he does indeed. He does indeed, and as does Guenon. So this is one of the things that they have in common. That they're interested. They're interested in hierarchy. They believe that there are natural hierarchies, and they believe that one of the mistakes of modernity is to deny that there are natural hierarchies, and that the healthy society has to be built around these natural hierarchies. And there's a slight difference of opinion between Guenon and Evola about which is the top caste, because Guenon, the intellectual, thinks that the top caste is the priestly caste, and the warrior caste comes next, whereas Evola, with his appreciation of the warrior, thinks that the royal and priestly authority should come together. So he doesn't follow. He sees himself as the warrior, and he did. He fought in the First World War. Second World War, his activity was purely political, although he did manage to get himself injured despite.
Was that in Vienna, wasn't it? I think he was bombed. Yeah. No, it's interesting. It really struck me that this particular sort of section of the book struck me because we're talking about this kind of caste system, because that seems to pop up in accelerationism as well. There seems to be a real crossover between the two at this point, where although the accelerationists seem to dislike the kind of traditional values, I suppose, or the traditional side of traditionalism almost, they seem to come to the same end point, where it seems to be that there is restoration of a kind of almost feudalism, or a kind of like a caste system. It is interesting, and they seem to sort of occupy similar spaces at times. And one in particular that seems to cross over is this idea of the Kali Yuga, which is something that Guenon is specifically obsesses over, doesn't he, to a degree?
Yes, this is of course another way in which Guenon describes modernity as the last of the four ages in the Hindu system, the Kali Yuga, as you say there. But all of these people are. Accelerations, of course, are a somewhat later phenomenon.
Yeah,
but what all of these people have in common is a sort of confident expectation that the current system is going to collapse. And can perhaps be encouraged to collapse.
Yeah.
because the sooner it collapses, the better, and then we can move on to something better. I mean, this isn't exclusive to them, because the Marxists, the Marxist-Leninists, were also convinced that the internal contradictions of capitalism would lead to its demise and so forth. So perhaps it's characteristic of radical people, of revolutionaries, to expect the end of the current system. But I mean, this is certainly something that Guenon was very clear about. That modernity was coming to an end, was going to come to an end, and this is also something that Evola was clear about, especially after the end of the Second World War, because he did clearly at one point think that an alliance of the two eagles, as he put it, an alliance of the German eagle and the Italian eagle, a Nazi fascist combination could perhaps bring about a new and better world. But when he didn't, he became profoundly pessimistic as well, and it's very difficult to see exactly what the late Evola, whether he thought that change was possible, whether he thought everything was doomed to collapse, or whether he thought it was worthwhile to struggle to fight for a new order, worthwhile in terms of achieving its objectives. I mean, he said, there was sort of existentialism here almost. He said, yes, for an individual, it's worthwhile to fight for the new order. For you individually, whether or not you're going to get anywhere, this is an activity that can bring you self-realization, and is therefore useful from that perspective. But whether he really thought that attempts to change society in the 1960s, early 70s, could actually achieve anything, or whether we were just stuck in the Kali Yuga and that's that, is not really clear.
It's interesting, if you look at some of the French intellectuals as well, a bit later on, they sort of seem to have this similar view that Evola had, where Evola seemed to have, later in his life especially, seemed to encourage a return to, I guess, nature and authenticity and this kind of thing, and you can see the same in stuff like Baudrillard is the one I always come back to, because I've read Baudrillard a lot. But he says the same thing, and it's kind of interesting that these two, opposing groups. I mean, Baudrillard was very, very left wing, and Evola was very, very right wing.
Well, I mean, of course, this is one of the old paradoxes, isn't it? That if you, it's the distinction you can make between reformists and radicals. That if you're more or less happy with things as they are, okay, then you're in one camp, and if you're extremely unhappy with things as they are, you're in a different camp. And that other camp contains people who tend to get classified as right or as left. But, sometimes actually they even admit that they have a bit more in common with each other.
Yeah. So we have a third character, important character, whose name I will butcher, so I will leave that name to you. Could you tell us about this third bearded character, very stern-looking character?
A stern-looking character.
Yeah.
A religious-looking character.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, if you had a visual dictionary of religious person, he'd be a very good fit, wouldn't he, as a visual?
I suspect that you are talking about Frithjof Schuon.
Yes, I am. Yeah.
So Frithjof, named after the Norwegian explorer Frithjof Nansen. His father was a musician, but obviously was keen about polar exploration, if that's what he called his son. Schuon, a German name. His father was a German, but he was working as a musician in Switzerland, so Schuon was born in Switzerland, and always he spoke he spent a lot of time in France. His mother was French. She moved to France after his father's death. Worked in France for a long time, but he always had a Swiss accent. So yes, well, I mean, his background, as I say, musician, Switzerland. Unlike any of these other characters, at one point he actually had to earn his living, which he did designing textiles. He worked in a textile factory. But fortunately, he acquired enough fans, including some with a bit of money, that after the 50s, I'd say 1950s, he didn't have to earn his living any longer because he was supported by his grateful followers. And he wrote about not just about esotericism, but also about religion. This is quite interesting, I think, because Guenon liked esotericism, which he put in contrast to exotericism, that is to say, exoteric religion, which he was really not very keen on, especially the Catholic Church. And of course, French intellectuals at the turn of the century were not generally very keen on the Catholic Church. And Italian intellectuals like Evola were absolutely not at all keen on the Catholic Church. And then along comes Schuon and decides that perhaps there's something to the Christian churches after all. Perhaps more to the Orthodox than to the Catholic Church. But Schuon is interested in exoteric religion as well as esotericism. And that's one of the things that makes him different. And another thing that makes him different is that he actually sets up his own Sufi order. The other people we've been talking about, you know, they're intellectuals, they're perhaps philosophers, they're writers. Occasionally they'll set up a journal or something, but none of them really set up a group. I mean, Evola becomes, after the Second World War, he becomes a sort of guru for a group that somebody else has set up, called Ordine Nuovo, which is actually a terrorist group. But Evola himself doesn't set this up. It splits off something else, and then they sort of grab Evola and say, "Please, you know, teach us,
guide us, O Master."
Professor. They often refer to him Professor. It wasn't actually a professor, but they call him Professor as well as Bannon. So both of them, what should we call them, honorary titles, I think. But Schuon does what everybody else has been doing, and he writes books and articles and so on. But he also sets up a religious group, and this turns out to be extremely important because a lot of the members of this group are also intellectuals. Some of them are professors working within the educational system. Some of them are working in museums, or whatever. But this means that they are also writing books, and as time passes, turning up on television and things like that. So they amplify Schuon's impact and influence and teachings very strongly, because there are lots of other people who are basing their understandings of the architecture of Fez or the nature of Native American religion Orthodox Christianity or music or many things like that. So they're applying Schuon's understanding, which, because it includes religion, is a bit different from Guénon's.
It's a bit more universalist, isn't it? It's
yes, it's more universalist, absolutely, and Guénon, anti-modernity, modern Catholic Church, completely excluded. Not quite as bad as Theosophy, but almost. Whereas Schuon is happy to work with the religions. I mean, he doesn't sort of start having meetings with bishops or anything like that, but he's promoting a more religious view of the world, and it is, as you say, universalistic.
Yeah, that's great. So they're all kind of at some point alive at the same time. So did these three traditionalists communicate?
Guenon and Schuon communicate, because there's Schuon is the younger man who reads Guénon's books, and, like many people, writes to Guénon, and there's a correspondence which develops, and it's actually Guénon who encourages Schuon to turn towards Sufism and so forth. And then towards the end of his life, gets increasingly critical of Schuon, because as far as Guénon is concerned, in order to be a proper Sufi, you have to be a proper Muslim, and in order to be a proper Muslim, you have to be a proper Muslim. Full stop, end of story. Whereas for Schuon, yes, to be a Sufi, to have access to the esoteric, you need to be some sort of a Muslim, but actually what really matters is the esotericism, not the Islam. So, especially if you're in Switzerland, you don't necessarily have to sort of fast the whole of Ramadan. And you can, if you're going to visit your relatives, and it'll look a bit weird if you're not drinking, you can have a beer or two, perhaps. And when Guenon hears about this, he says, "No, stop! This is all going completely the wrong direction. This is modern. This is fiddling with things. This isn't authentic. This is not the real thing. Whole point is to go to the real thing." So, and the Guenon is old at this point, and soon dies. But there is this breach between him and Schuon. Guenon and Evola, they never meet. It's really, Evola is more impacted by Guenon than the other way around.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So it seems that myth plays a big part in traditionalism as well, and also the Vedanta is very important to Guenon. Yeah. But Guenon and Evola had two very different, two very different kind of approaches to that. Almost like Evola seemed to feel that you could extract truth from these things, whereas Guenon, I keep hitting this microphone. Guenon, it felt that was the truth. The Vedanta.
I mean, also the texts. I mean, the texts that you're referring to are somewhat different as well.
Yeah.
So, Guenon is most interested, as you say, in reading Vedanta, and that's quite doctrinal, quite philosophical. Whereas Evola, as a good Roman imperialist, likes classical myth. And he treats myth a bit differently. As you said, he has the idea that one can find truth in the myth, whereas precisely as you said, for Guenon, Vedanta is the truth.
Mm.
You don't need to extract it in the same way. And Evola is also a bit more omnivorous than Guenon is.
One thing that I found really interesting was that in your book you talk about the sort of decline of the centre left and centre right being a kind of doorway for the traditionalist movement to shuffle through almost.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, if this is part of the bigger question of the rise of the right, or the rise of the radical right, and this is crucial to explaining the growing popularity of political traditionalism, because if you think of political traditionalism as a boat floating on the sea, as the sea itself rises, the boat rises.
Mm.
And this was very visible actually with Dugin, who, when I first met him, read him, he was a very marginal figure in Yeltsin's democratic Russia. And visibly what happened there was that Dugin's views, which were very much influenced by Evola as well as Guenon, came closer and closer to the mainstream. Not because he was changing what he was saying, but because the Russian mainstream was moving quite dramatically between, the early Yeltsin years and mid-Putin period. So that's the Russian case. But if one's looking at the West as a whole, then it's you have to look also at what's been happening in Western politics over the last 30 years. And there's lots of people talk about the rise of the populist right, or nobody's quite sure what terms to apply. But I mean, very clearly something is happening. And you can see it not so much in the UK, because the UK has this rather odd two-party system. But if you look in countries, most other European countries, which have got some sort of multi-party system, you just have to look at the voting figures. And, there's some obscure right-wing party that somehow manages to get into parliament, and everybody thinks, how weird, oh dear, dear, and come back a bit later, and this party is getting 25% of the vote, and come back a bit later in certain countries, and they're actually forming the government. So there is this very clear phenomenon, especially clear, as I say, in other European countries, of the rise of the right. And how has this happened? Well, it's you always have push and pull, don't you? You have, if something's moving into a space, something has to move out of that space, or if something does move out of a space, that invites other things to move into it. And I think it's clear also that the left-right politics that people of my generation grew up, which was about this titanic struggle between the mining unions and I mean, there aren't any miners any longer. It's all finished. Most we've got, we can try and have a titanic struggle between the junior doctors or something, but it's not quite the same. The great battle of socialism against capitalism, it's over. So what's going to replace it? To some extent, what people call value politics has replaced it. That, I mean, if the old politics, if one could call that class-based politics, well, it's different groups nowadays. But also, to some extent, partly part of this because the right is also becoming a sort of identity group of its own.
Mm-hmm.
But anyhow, you've got, as the old politics moves out, a new politics moves in, and part of that new politics is that parts of the right, which had previously been marginal and nobody taken very seriously, become less and less marginal, and therefore the thought within those groups becomes more and more important. I mean, one of the questions is, why has everybody started translating Evola into every language you can possibly think of? When I was first reading Evola, there were, I think there you could find a translation of something or other into French. But I mean, basically, you had to read them in Italian, and the English translations didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do you want them in English? Do you want them in Hungarian? Do you want them in German? It's so you can see this growing interest simply in the growing number of translations.
Yeah, even some of his kind of more occult works have been translated into English now, and you're seeing like a kind of occult style books being released. There's a real trend within the occult at the moment to release these kind of almost talismanic looking, very beautiful books, lovely editions, which is say of books. But you're starting to see certain Evola books come out in that strain as well, which is very interesting.
Yeah. So that gives us this overlap between the esoteric and the political.
Yeah, and that's obviously something I find. So Bannon's traditionalism is interesting. I wonder what Guenon would have thought of Bannon's traditionalism, and would he even recognized it as traditionalism?
Guenon had a big problem with the United States. There's this lovely exchange between him and Ananda Coomaraswamy, who was a sort of Sri Lankan English guy who moved to the US and who worked a lot on symbolism. And Coomaraswamy says at the end of a letter, the Guenon's correspondence is never very personal, but Coomaraswamy says at the end of a letter that he's going away to the woods for the summer. And Guenon writes back and says, "What do you mean to the woods? Do you have woods in America?" Coomaraswamy says, "Yes, I'll send you a photograph." So Guenon, who never went anywhere near the United States, had this idea of the United States as the sort of apogee of modernity, which Dugin has to some extent as well.
Yeah, I'd say that.
So I think, I mean, what Dugin has, what Bannon, I beg your pardon, what Bannon has taken mostly from Guenon is the critique of modernity and the need for some sort of spiritual counterweight to that. And for Bannon himself, this is the Catholic Church. Now, Schuon would probably have been okay with that, but Guenon was not okay with the Catholic Church because he thought that the Catholic Church had completely lost the esoteric content that once it had had. So for him, the Catholic Church was irredeemably modern. And at one point he thought that perhaps a bit of Hinduism, a bit of Sufism might revive the Catholic Church. But he really gave up on that idea. So Guénon's first objection would be to Bannon's Catholicism. And his second objection would be that Bannon is trying to change society directly rather than trying to change the intellectual and spiritual bases of society.
And that's kind of an interesting thing, because Guenon sort of, in a weird way, he kind of, part of his kind of traditionalist mission, I suppose, was to influence, wasn't it? To use what we'd call influencers these days, almost to try and change the mindset of society.
Yeah, and here, I mean, here we get we once again we get a substantial agreement, and then we get certain disagreements on details within the movement, because Guénon's idea was of a small group of people who might transmit wisdom, esoteric understandings, etc., to the new age that would start after the end of the current one, to the new cycle that would start after the end of the current Yuga. Whereas Evola was more interested in political action. And if we look at the new right today, with the way that they've all been reading Gramsci, or at least reading people who've been reading Gramsci, there is a very definite idea there that by changing the terms of the public debate, we can change the outcome of that debate, that we can indeed change reality by influencing the way people are talking about things and the way that people are thinking about things. So we have the same basic idea that you need to change the intellectual, philosophical, esoteric underpinnings of phenomena, and then the phenomena will change. But we have three different takes on how possible it is, on the scale at which we should do that.
One thing, but I'll let you go shortly. I have one question that had been kind of not bugging me, but it kind of interested me in the book, which was Guenon seemed to be very aware of Orientalism when it came to the occult, or to esotericism, yet and seemed to swerve that using that kind of critique using traditionalism. However, there are some that argue that he sort of suffered from a reverse Orientalism.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, here, of course, we've got two different senses of the word Orientalism. We've got the original sense, where Orientalism means the study of Oriental languages and literatures, and then we've got the later use established by Edward Said, where Orientalism means the intellectual aspect of the unequal power relations which are behind Western colonialism. And Guénon died before Said, years before Said, decades before Said produced that second meaning. And he lived in an age where there wasn't actually an awful lot of discussion about colonialism, certainly not in the West. Guénon didn't actually like colonialism because he saw it as the imposition of Western modernity on traditional societies. So he was an early anti-imperialist in that sense. The reason that he didn't like Orientalism in the meaning he had in his time, which was the study of Oriental languages and literatures, was that not that he saw scholars of Oriental languages and literatures as part of imperialism, although he probably would have agreed with that idea if anybody had asked him, but because he saw them as understanding only externalities, as people who had no esoteric experience. People who wrote about the Vedantas or about Sufism or whatever, purely on the basis of texts that they didn't really understand, because they'd never been there, because they'd never done that, because they'd never participated. So for him, their understandings were inevitably partial and second-hand. And to have a real understanding, you had to have done what Ageli did. You have to sit there with a master, with a teacher, and learn directly, and then practice it. Because the whole point of all these theology and philosophy is not an intellectual game. It's a way to achieve self-realization.
I was going to actually ask that. It might even seem like a silly question, but did Guenon consider himself a mystic in that sense? You know,
it's a very complicated question, because Guenon had a certain understanding of mysticism, which was a rather weird one, and he condemned what he understood as mysticism for being just a sort of random emotional state. Now, that is because he had a rather weird understanding of what mysticism was. In fact, in many ways, I, as a scholar, would classify Guénon's work as mysticism. But, you know, there's a big discussion about what do we mean by mysticism. Right?
Yeah.
But what I mean by mysticism, at least today, is this tradition of seeking a return to our transcendent origin that we identify with the Neoplatonists, with Meister Eckhart, with the Sufis, etc., etc., etc. And if we call that mysticism, again, I was certainly participating in his writings, in his actions, in everything, in that very broad tradition. So in that sense, Guenon was a mystic. But in the rather weird way that he understood mysticism, he criticized, condemned it.
Interesting.
But that, I think, is because he got this rather unusual understanding of mysticism, which really related to what late 19th century mainstream Catholicism was called mysticism.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you so much for giving us some of your time. Where can people find you online if
they can find me online at Aarhus University. And there's also a blog about traditionalism, and if you just Google Traditionalists blog, 2 separate words, that should bring you to my blog. And there's a nice new book out.
I have it here, but I don't have the dust cover. I have the. Unfortunately, I'll flash it up on the screen. But it's certainly it's the most lucid account of traditionalism I've ever read. I mean, there's a lot of essays about traditionalism within other books, but this is definitely the kind of the go-to, I'd say now.
Well, that was, I mean, my objective was to make something which isn't always easy to understand. And which, you know, I mean, you started with the question of what do we mean by traditional?
Yeah.
You know, which isn't always easy to understand. But I think which does make a certain amount of sense. And whether or not you buy the whole system in all respects, it's still, I think, you know, there are enough interesting things in it, even if you don't buy the whole system, to provide some unusual vantage points from which to think about modernity in politics and religion and things like that.
I think it also it provides a good inroad for people that might find Guenon's work quite impenetrable as well, because
Yes. Guenon is not easy reading, and it helps an awful lot to know what you're what you're going to find before you get into it. Yeah.
I guess the last question is, what's next? What's your next book going to be about, or next study?
I've got a couple of projects that I'm working on, and I'm not quite sure which ones.